We can to try to make this space welcoming and engaging for you to the best of our ability. I want to just introduce you and welcome you all to the space. Personally, I will say that I was very inspired and moved by the protests that happened in Cal Poly Humboldt in the spring. I was very much connected to the threads and the pain of the death in Gaza. I think here at Humboldt we tend to have sometimes a problem of amnesia, where we sometimes forget about our experiences or pretend they didn't happen. And tonight's conversation is very much driven by a desire to continue honest, compassionate, and sincere dialogue and conversation. We want to welcome y'all in the spirit of more dialogue rather than less. We're very excited to have this conversation, and I will just say again, this was organized grassroots by 5 human individuals. We're doing the absolute best we can, and you will see us stretch thin at times, but we couldn't not do something. And I think that's at the heart of this. So, and you'll notice that I'm acting as the door person this evening, helping with catering, made the coffee, also an MC, so we'll be running around solving problems, doing the best we can as the evening progresses. Please, a lot of this requires a certain amount of community compassion within your own spaces. We have table facilitators at each table. In most cases, in a few situations, y'all just might want to encourage dialogue and conversation amongst yourselves. So, we kick things off by just acknowledging the fundamental premise, which is that here in Humboldt County, every single location and place that we have was known and named by indigenous nations and communities before folks showed up here in the settler colonialist dynamic. We acknowledge that the land we're gathered on right now is unceded territory of the Wiyot people. And in addition, institutions that are connected in these spaces exist in territories that were known, owned, and loved by the Hupa, Kurok, Matol, Talawa, Wailaki, and Yurok peoples. We honor them and all neighboring tribes in our ongoing commitment to develop trusting, reciprocal, and long-lasting relationships. We encourage folks to understand and commit and connect to Native sovereignty struggles here in this place, including the honor tax and other tangible ways to contribute to sovereignty. I want to welcome and introduce our folks to kick things off. Rabbi Naomi Steinberg is retired from teaching courses in Judaism at Cal Poly Humboldt and has been one of our organizers, and Dr. Keith Flamer, who serves as the president of the College of the Redwoods since 2015. Thank you very much.
Welcome to you all. 42 years ago, I was a student at College of the Redwoods, and more recently taught at Cal Poly for 10 years. I love both schools. I'm speaking today on my own behalf. My expertise is in Jewish religious traditions. Last spring, Austin Roberts invited me to speak in his World Religions class at CR, and then we talked about organizing a community forum on the war, including the religious aspects of the long conflict. We brainstormed with Sarah Hart, Maxwell Schnurer, President Flamer gave us his support and introduced us to Kinte Johnson, they have all been acknowledged. We worked over the summer to plan this event. Anything wrong with the event is entirely our fault. We are here in a friendly, supportive atmosphere to discuss extremely serious life and death issues. We hope these sessions strengthen our community, help us become better citizens and better humans. We want to avoid unhelpful generalizations and stereotypes. We recognize that both Palestinian and Israeli populations are diverse with deep internal divisions. I have family, friends, and colleagues in Israel and Palestine, as well as cultural and ancestral ties to the region. Both my physical DNA and my spiritual DNA are Middle Eastern. I feel the pain of this conflict in my bones. I grieve to see both Palestinians and Israelis suffering in the grip of what I consider fanatical, immoral leadership. Some years ago, I traveled to Israel and the West Bank with rabbis for human rights and met with Jewish, Palestinian and Bedouin social justice and peace activists, and bereaved families. We went to refugee camps, settlements, border checkpoints. Travel to Gaza was not possible due to the Israeli blockade and the aftermath of the bitter Hamas-Fatah civil war in 2007. Last fall, I wasn't surprised by the outbreak of violence, but stunned by the brutality of the October 7 massacre, the terrible fate of the hostages, including children, enormous civilian suffering, sexualized violence, and the horrific death toll, destruction, and environmental devastation in Gaza. When we started planning the event, I fervently hoped the fighting would be over long before the fall. Now hundreds of thousands of Israelis are taking to the streets, demanding a ceasefire and hostage deal. Last winter, I read a New York Times article that quoted former Cal Poly history professor Lina Dalasha, who identifies as a Palestinian citizen of Israel. Dr. Dalasha said, "Historians refuse to accept inevitability. History develops as a result of human agency. In other words, war is not inevitable. Decade after decade, there were missed opportunities for peaceful resolution. We're meeting today at a dire moment in history: catastrophic flooding in Africa and Europe, massive famine in Sudan, collapse of civil society in Venezuela and Lebanon, war in Ukraine, Yemen, Gaza, and Israel. I'm glad to see students here. Thank you for caring and taking the time to come. I'm appalled and ashamed that you have to deal with so many disturbing images in your news feeds and your lives. Gun violence, racism, hunger, climate crisis, war. You shouldn't have to read about families massacred or crushed under the debris of their homes. You have every right to be shocked and angry, and my generation is at fault. We should have and could have handed you a healthier, saner, safer world. Many of us have dreamed of it and worked for it for years, but collectively, we didn't do enough. So I'll start this program by saying how deeply sorry I am. If anyone else here identifies as an elder or a community leader and shares my feelings of remorse, please stand for a moment of silent apology to our young people. Apologies do not undo the damage, but they can heal some of the hurt. Now it's my honor to introduce College of the Redwoods President, Dr. Keith Flamer.
Good evening. I wish that we were gathered here for another reason. I wake up every day bothered by the conflict that we see, not just in Gaza, but the conflict and the deaths of children we see in Ukraine, and the conflict and deaths we see in our country. I go to bed having those images in my mind, that if it wasn't them, it would be my children. And that bothers me significantly. And it bothers me to a point where I wake up in the morning when I think about the deaths that I see. I I get reinforced to the fact that I have to do more. We have to do more as a country and as a community. My college has to do more, to do what it can, not just in education, but to make a difference. Can we change the world? Absolutely. But we have to start here. I'm awfully proud of what our students and our faculty did at Cal Poly, because they exercised what I believe is their First Amendment rights. That's important. As someone who was in the front lines when I was a young man, being arrested by the police and thrown in jail and having to call my mom and dad to come bail me out of jail. And I can't reinforce the fact how important that is. That when my father got me out of jail for doing the things that I thought were right, and I was getting kicked out of school, he said, "Son, I'm very proud of you for standing up for what you think is the right thing to do. And I may not agree with what some of the motivations, but I'm awfully proud that our students feel enough and feel empowered enough to make a difference where they can. And I'm proud that our faculty are encouraging students to think beyond themselves to make a difference. And it was from that commitment and that admiration for our students and our faculty that I committed to this event. This event is not to celebrate, far from it. This event is to try our best to bring our community back together. There is so much divisiveness in our country, and our rhetoric is hate and fear. And we've absorbed that as a community, and we have to do something different. We have to do better. Our community is way too important for our children to keep the divisive rhetoric going. The only way that we're going to heal ourselves is by sitting down, having an honest conversation, understanding the other person's point of view. You may not agree, but my college is committed to doing what it can to facilitate conversations with anyone. This is the first of hopefully many community events that we start coming back together. And I promise that my college will be right next to you, helping us move forward as a community. So welcome tonight, and I look forward to further conversations.
We're honored to have Professor Kathy Lee here. She has taught classes on Middle East conflict at Cal Poly before her retirement. I find Kathy tremendously wise, fair-minded, a generous teacher. I apologize, she had hoped to have some big maps projected on the screen here, but alas, that technical detail slipped past us. So there is probably one handout on each table that has some of the maps, some of the definitions. Kathy can make some of that available to you online if you want it. We can send it to registrants. So I apologize. I'm going to invite everyone to imagine a map of the region. And that's a good stretch of our brains. And Kathy's going to lead us through a quick mini lecture that'll give us some answers to the questions. Who controls the Middle East? Who pays the bills? What is the geopolitical context of this terrible war going on now? So please welcome Professor Lee.
The Middle East. There it is. Okay. Well, good evening. I encountered an essay recently that was written by a journalist by the name of Amanda Scoggins, who wrote a book about the conflict in the Sudan. And she said, if you look at the Sudan and you look at it as a map, there's a layer on top of the history. And if you peel that layer away, there's a layer underneath of the current political conflict. And if you peel that away, there's the religious conflict between the Muslims in the north and the Christians and animists in the south. And if you peel that away, there's linguistic and cultural differences. And if you peel that layer away, there's the economic disparity between these two regions. So she said that each time you add a new layer to the conflict, you don't get rid of the layers that were there underneath. You just add to it. So there's an endless opportunity for continuing conflict. Tonight, I want to talk about just one of those layers, which is the history of how the modern Middle East was created. And when we look at history, one of the famous quotes from the Holocaust historian, Lucy Davidovich, was, "We look at the past through the prism of the present, and we try to discern the future." So a prism bends the light, and the present tends to shape the way that we look at the past, often to support our positions in the present. And in the case of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, there's a lot of really strong distortions of that prism. And so just to introduce that, I'd like to talk about some of those. One of the distortions you hear all the time, and I hear this from people all the time, these people have been fighting for centuries. That's not true. This conflict is about 100 years old. It emerges after World War I, and that's really what I kind of want to focus on today. Because it's very important to see that the conflict was not caused by the people who lived there. The conflict was caused by outside forces who sought to control the people who lived there. So that's one myth. The other myth is there's no such thing as a Palestinian or Palestine. Golda Meir famously said, "There's no such thing as a Palestine. There's nobody we can give the land back to." That's not true. The people who lived in this area identified themselves as Palestinians. When the British mandate was established there, what they called it was the British Mandate for Palestine. And there's a difference between nations and states that we'll talk about in just a minute. It kind of explains that confusion. The last one is the saying, "It was a land with no people for a people with no land." And that's also not accurate, because there were about 750,000 people there at the time of World War I. And what happened is a state was created for a traumatized people that in turn traumatized the indigenous population where that state came to be located. So 3 myths that tend to distort the way that we look at the conflict. So, sovereignty. A lot of the conflict can be explained by this term that we call sovereignty. Sovereignty means that that people in a specific geographic area have the ability to control what happens within that area and to protect themselves from outside entities interfering with that. Today, as we'll see, there's a lot of variety in the Middle East as to who has sovereignty and who doesn't. There's a lot of interference in the countries from outside forces that exacerbate the conflict. The conflict in the Middle East can be seen really as a quest for sovereignty after the collapse of the Ottoman Empire. One of the myths of these people have been fighting for centuries, is that this area was really not an area of conflict. For hundreds of years, it was mostly just a backwater of the Ottoman Empire. It was important for religious tourism because there were holy sites for all 3 Abrahamic religions. But it wasn't particularly strategic. It wasn't all that important economically. And so there wasn't a lot of conflict there. The people simply went about their lives. Okay? So, the difference between nations and states. A nation is a group of people who have a collective identity, who occupy a certain region. A with defined borders. A nation-state is a combination of both. So, an example of a nation is the Navajo Nation, occupying a specific area with a common culture. The Ottoman Empire was a state, but it was a state that included many, many nations, okay? And a nation-state, again, is what the modern construct is. So when people say there was never a Palestine, there was never a Palestinian state prior to World War II. Just listen. But there was a Palestinian nation. The other point is, there was not an Iraq, there was not a Syria, there was not a Lebanon, there was not a Kuwait, there was not a Saudi Arabia, and there wasn't an Israel, right? So nations are not the same as states. And so you can't erase the people by saying, well, you don't have a state. Because after World War I, the European powers carved up the Middle East and created these states, right? Two groups of people were left out. One of them occupies northern Iraq, northern Syria, and southeast Turkey. Anybody know who that is? The Kurds, okay? Didn't get a state, has been fighting to get a state ever since. The other one was the Palestinians, and it wasn't convenient either for the surrounding Arab countries or for Britain to have a Palestinian state. So, nations and states. So the British, well, the Irish have a saying, my people. God doesn't, the sun never sets on the British Empire because God doesn't trust the Brits in the dark. And during World War I, Britain was fighting against the Ottoman Empire because the Ottoman Empire was allied with Germany and Austria-Hungary. And they wanted to open up a second front, particularly after their disastrous campaign in Gallipoli. And they decided that they wanted to convince the Arabs to fight with them against the Ottomans. And so they went to the Emir of the Hijaz, Emir Hussein, who controlled the western part of the Arabian Peninsula. And they said in the McMahon-Hussein correspondence in 1915 and 1916, if you fight with us, we will help you establish an Arab kingdom in all of these areas where the Arabs live in the Middle East. And we'll call it the Hashemite Kingdom of Arabia. On your handout, there's a map of this. It was everything other than Lebanon was going to be this thing. Now, the Emir had two sons, Faisal and Abdullah. Faisal fought with T.E. Lawrence of Arabia, and he ended up being installed by the British as the king of Iraq. His brother Abdullah was installed in Jordan as the king of Jordan. In fact, today, the current king Abdullah of Jordan is the great-great-grandson of the Emir of the Hijaz, and Jordan is called the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan. So it traces it back to this period of time. So at the same time that they promised the Arabs that they would have this Arab state, they wanted to get the support of European Jews to support it as well. So they started negotiating with the Jewish population in Europe to establish a Jewish homeland in Palestine. And we see that in a document that's called the Balfour Declaration in 1917. The negotiations happened before that. So they wanted the Arabs for two reasons. First of all, they needed the manpower. But they also wanted to not have the Ottomans say that this is a holy war between Christianity and Islam. And having the Emir who controlled the holy cities of Mecca and Medina would help them in that process. They also wanted the support of the Jewish population, not only in Great Britain and the Allies, but also in the Axis powers, and forming a Jewish homeland. Now, the British never had any intention of creating a Jewish state. They wanted a homeland for the Jewish people. They planned to control it all themselves. Because meanwhile, so we've got the Arab promise, we've got the Jewish promise, and now we have the Sykes-Picot Agreement, which is an agreement between the French and the British, with the Italians and the Russians along for the ride, to carve up the Middle East for themselves. And they were going to, and so France was going to control what became Syria and Lebanon, and the British were going to control the rest of it, including they'd have direct control over the Persian Gulf, where they had just discovered large quantities of petroleum. So the Sykes-Picot Agreement was secret, but it came out in, the communists, the Bolsheviks, released it when they got a copy of it. And after World War I, there's this push for self-determination, to say nations should have their own state. So they say, okay, we're going to create these states. We're going to have Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, Iraq, right? But you're not ready, right? So you have this period that's called the mandates. And during the mandates, they said, well, you have a king, right? You have this country, but you're not ready. I kind of think of mandates as training wheels for nation states. And so they said, we're going to control things until you're ready. And that was the status of these countries until after World War II. If you look at the map that's on the handout that shows the dates of independence, you find that it happens after World War II for most of these countries, where they really had independence. And that's because after World War II, especially after the UN Charter, it's not okay to be a colonial power. And you see this period of decolonization. So, as a result of that, and particularly with the movement of people to Palestine from Europe, you begin to see some stresses emerge in the area. Now, when we talk about Zionists, in this case, Zionists today can end up being used as a pejorative. I'm not using it that way. This was a movement that started in the late 1800s, where European Jews said, we will never assimilate completely into Gentile society. The only thing that we can do is find a Jewish homeland. And so this was a political movement at that time to establish that homeland. Now, prior to World War I, the Jewish population in Palestine was less than 10%. By 1930, it's about 16%. And at the time of independence, it's about 30%. So as the people began to move in, it starts to cause stresses and strains in the society. Very often the land was held, they were tenant farmers or tenant renters for absentee landlords. And so land would be bought, houses would be bought, people would be evicted from their land and from their houses, and you start to see conflicts emerge in the population. Now, this is the time where the British are in charge there, right? And so the British try to settle this down with a variety of ways of saying, well, we'll divide this territory between the Palestinians and the Jewish populations. The first one was called the Peel Commission in 1937, where and there's a map there of that. The Jewish population said that they accepted this division of the area, but Ben-Gurion made it really clear, and this is really well documented, that the plan was to accept the partition and then move to annex the rest of Palestine. The British finally gave up. They gave up particularly after terrorists blew up their headquarters in the King David Hotel in Jerusalem. Those were Jewish terrorists from the Irgun movement, and they said, we're leaving, we've had it with this. And the UN said, well, let's come up with a different way of doing partition. And in that case, again, the Jewish population supported it because it gave international recognition to the Jewish state. The Arabs opposed it because they said, we're not getting the percentage of the land that reflects our percentage of the population. Also, we're not getting the best land in terms of its productive value for agriculture and things like that. So they said, we're not accepting this. The surrounding Arab powers did not accept it because they said, we don't want the Europeans coming in and telling us how we should run things and making these decisions for us, because that's essentially what was happening. These things did not really involve the people that were there. It tended to be people from the outside making these proposals as to how this should work. Now, after the British left, the British ended the mandate. The day after the British ended the mandate, Israel declared its independence. And it's at that point that we see another layer in this conflict. And that's the Nakba, the displacement of the Palestinian population in the lands that were considered to be, that was going to be the state of Israel, which was far more than either partition plan had proposed. There were about 750,000 people who were forced out of their homes. About 15,000 people were killed. The Arab states attacked Israel. Israel repelled those attacks. Those newly formed states did not have well-organized military. And then at that point, anyone who tried to come back to get their land, or to get their homes, or to get some of their possessions, was forced back out of the country. So one of the statuses that we see today with this is the people that were displaced at that time do not have the ability to come back to Palestine. And that is the so-called right of return. That's one of the contentious aspects of this. So at that point, there are more conflicts with the surrounding Arab countries. There's the Suez Crisis in the 1950s. There's other flare-ups on border skirmishes. But things went along that way until 1967 and the Six-Day War in 1967. At that point, the West Bank, which had been part of Jordan, was occupied. The Golan Heights, which had been part of Syria, was occupied. And the Gaza Strip, which had been part of Egypt, was occupied, along with the Sinai Peninsula. The Sinai Peninsula was returned to Egypt in the 1980s in the agreement between Egypt and Israel. But this is kind of where the origins of this conflict are. And it's something that doesn't really come up in our discussions of it. But in the same way that I said, we look at the past through the prism of the present and try to discern the future, it's that distortion of the history of the creation of these states that caused this problem. If we look today in this question of sovereignty, there are some countries in the area that really are sovereign countries. Turkey, Jordan, Saudi Arabia, the Arab Emirates, they're all, Turkey's moving towards authoritarianism. The other ones are all authoritarian governments. There are states which have to contend with outside interference that really hampers their ability to control what's happening in their country. In the case of Lebanon, you have there was a huge Syrian occupation there for a long period of time. Syria left, but Iran has moved into that. And an Iranian-backed militia called Hezbollah operates in the southern part of Lebanon. Syria has a large presence of Russians and a large presence of Iranians. Iraq has had a large presence of the United States. There are still U.S. forces in Iraq. And also, Iran is an influence there. So you can't really say that those countries are sovereign because they don't really control everything that's happening there. They're at the mercy of these other countries coming in. And if you look at Israel, Israel is often defined as the only democracy in the Middle East. If you look at Israel proper, 20% of the population is Palestinian. They face what we call de jure and de facto discrimination. Their identities cards identify them as Palestinian. They are limited in the roles that they can fill in society, and they face a tremendous amount of discrimination. They also face way, way less per capita investment in their schools and infrastructure. But for Palestinians in the West Bank, they are in small enclaves that are separated by Jewish settlements that began in 1967 and have accelerated greatly since that period of time. There are checkpoints. If you want to go from Nablus to Bethlehem, you have to go through multiple checkpoints. And so with all of those things, this is not a democracy for the people in the occupied territories. And that is why you have this continuing tension there. There's always a reason for that. Okay? So, I want to leave some, do we have time for some questions? Okay. I realize that's a lot, and it's hard to sort of narrow things down to a 20-minute presentation, but I hope that it helps you understand a little bit. Tomorrow night, I'm going to talk about a different layer on that map, and that layer is that what we call historical trauma, because you have two peoples that have experienced this historical trauma and how that has shaped the way that they respond to the conflict. Okay. So, again with the questions, because our time is so limited, please make it a question and not a statement, because we'll have a chance to make statements when we have small group discussions.
Thank you. Appreciate what you shared with us. I just want to ask about language that you use, because I've heard that a lot, that it's a conflict, that it's a war. And some of us here, maybe many of us, I don't know, see it as an occupation and see it as genocide. Could you speak to that, please?
Yes, well, the term genocide has a different meaning in how it's used politically and how it's used legally. Okay. And so the determination as to whether or not there is a genocide occurring is determined by the International Court of Justice under the specific provisions of the Genocide Convention. And that analysis is ongoing. There's no doubt whatsoever that there have been war crimes by both sides. And on the other hand, the determination, the specific determination of genocide has to be legally determined by the International Court.
What about occupation?
Occupation, well, the International Court of Justice has recently ruled that the occupation is against international law.
Criminal! It's an apartheid!
So, that again, that's an ongoing thing.
Call it what it is!
So you said right here that Israel is a hybrid sovereignty within the pre-1967 borders. What exactly do you mean by hybrid sovereignty? I don't believe.
Well, I'm referring to the fact that you have to consider what's happening within Israel's borders. And within Israel's borders, the Palestinians are citizens. They actually have representation in the Knesset. Not a lot, but they do it. But within the occupied territories, they don't. And Palestinian citizens of East Jerusalem are not citizens of Israel. So that they really don't have citizenship. Right? They're permanent residents.
It's an apartheid!
since we cannot comment, I'll just turn my comment into question. First of all, you're saying that the conflict is not over 100 years old. It is over 100 years old. What we're witnessing today is continuation of all preceding 1948, and now we're witnessing a continuation of Nakba. But the other thing I want to turn it into question, you said that the Zionist movement is a political movement. It is not a political movement, it's ethno-colonial apartheid movement beginning in the current state.
No, actually what I said was that when the British were negotiating with the Zionists, at that point it was a political
They
movement.
never negotiated, Balfour, 1917, was declaration, was a letter by the foreign minister at that time to Roosevelt, and he promised him to give him a state for Jewish people, take it from Palestine.
Thank you.
They basically gave, homeland for Jewish people, for a whole, indigenous people to be displaced and to be, ethnically cleansed, and it's continuing until now.
Well, I think that's kind of what I said. Well, maybe, let me say that that's what I meant.
Okay, let's say what you mean.
One final question.
Final question?
So, when we started this, we all acknowledged and recognized that we are on native land. And so, if we were to go back in time and look at the struggle of all the different tribes that are here, we wouldn't have called it a conflict. We would have called it a genocide because that's what they went through. So why is the word conflict constantly being thrown around when it's obvious, it's for everyone to see that it's a genocide? I mean, why is the word conflict being used?
Well, it's one of the many terms that are given to what's happening. It's war. Is ethnic cleansing? Is displacement? There's lots of terms that you can put to it. I'm just saying that when you use genocide as a rhetorical term to make your case, it's different than when an International Criminal Court of Justice makes that determination.
It's accurate. According to genocide experts. Fred Lockford.
I'd just like to say that everyone who came here saw our shared agreements on how we were going to speak to each other. And there's been a lot of tension in our community, certainly since last fall. The goal of this is for people to converse and not to yell at each other. We have many opportunities to yell at each other. So the folks who are yelling are interfering with other people being able to listen. Some people have hearing impairments. Some people can't hear beyond your yelling. So you might want to tone it down.
The Israeli Human Rights Organization
I
calls it apartheid.
I will say,
January 2021, it's right here. Look
I
it
will
up.
say that most people here want a conversation. Raise your hand if you want to hear lots of yelling to continue this evening. Okay, raise your hand. Raise your hand. Okay? So I'm letting you know, folks who are yelling, you can see there are very few of you who appreciate your yelling. And unfortunately, you don't do your positions any justice. I will say,
Palestinian family does not require apartheid denial. Human rights organizations over and over again say it's apartheid in East Jerusalem, Israel, Gaza, and in the occupied West Bank. Not debate. It is apartheid.
Thank you. I appreciate your perspective. I appreciate your perspective.
There's only been one perspective. Let us get the right.
Thank you. I appreciate your truth. It is.
I appreciate it. Let us get the mic.
It is now on our. We are past time. We have a lot of folks here. We're going to get to our next agenda item, which is. I would like in this moment to invite Rabbi Naomi, Reverend Daniel London, and Imam Abubakr to have a moment speaking to the question
something to the discussion about genocide that I heard from Ronnie Schwartz, who is the director of, what's the right name of the institute now? The Institute for Altruistic Behavior on campus that started by our beloved Sam Alliner, a Holocaust genocide survivor. And Ronnie helped me a lot when I was really struggling with this language over the winter. And he just pointed out, as Kathy said, there are legal definitions of genocide which can and should be pursued to the full extent of international law. And then there are also colloquial conceptualizations of genocide, of how we use it. And it's very important to acknowledge that the colloquial expressions are important. It's no one can control anyone else, no one can tell anybody, you think it's genocide, you're wrong. That's how they feel. That's a legitimate feeling. It's a different matter to say, take it to the criminal court. There's no question in my mind that if this number of Jews had been killed in this recent upsurge of violence, undoubtedly we would be saying genocide. Undoubtedly, we would all be feeling that. So, as every Jewish person who studies Jewish history struggles with the horrifying, horrifying images we have been inundated with of genocide, Holocaust. So it's a particularly painful situation for Jews in America now who feel, I'm looking at people being murdered in massive numbers. What is this? What does this look like? So I'm going to ask you folks to quiet down simply because I'm going to take consensus. How many people in the room would like to have no more yelling so we can discuss?
How many people want Palestinians? How many people want Palestinians overthrown? How many people want Palestinians?
I would like to commend Dr. I would like to commend. Max?
No offense. This is propaganda.
Okay.
You have us in here scared by Israeli news. You have us in here trying, like sitting down listening to a 15-minute lecture. No PowerPoint, nothing, man.
Excuse us. I'm sorry we didn't have
I asked
PowerPoint.
politely for the mic, bud. I asked politely.
Okay.
We asked politely.
Maxwell said that a presentation had been prepared and we were looking forward to hearing it. I don't think anyone's as excited about hearing it. Dr. Awad spoke very beautifully and respectfully, delivering a very serious and important comment, and I want to commend him. He did it without yelling, without screaming, without intimidating and harassing anybody else. And he is a long member of this community.
You say Jewish people here are sad? Say
Okay.
Palestinians are sad. We're all sad watching genocide. That's all we're saying. Stop censoring Jewish people when it's Palestinians that are dying. 500,000 people there are dying. My family is there. We're sad too. And I'm not a Jewish person. We are all sad, not just Jewish people.
Disrupting the whole thing. Nobody can say it.
Do you have a student? Can you just get
Palestinians are sad, not just one
I
group.
have a question. Could you just get a student up there to speak?
Yes. We would be. Maxwell told me that students had prepared a statement, and you are more than welcome to come and give that now. We have to stop at 7:20 for Muslim prayers. So if somebody can come up and make a statement, please, we will be honored to hear it.
On behalf of Humble for Palestine, and not even just Humble for Palestine, the majority of Americans are horrified by what's going on. We are a community collective committed to educating the public about Palestine for nearly a year, and we expressed our deep concern and disappointment with the structure of this event. It deliberately excludes a crucial Palestinian voice by failing to invite local activists who have tirelessly organized educational and cultural events on this issue. It also disregards the expertise of Cal Poly scholars who study this topic, while neglecting the inclusion of those involved in the academic protests. Instead, the event gives a platform to individuals responsible for causing harm to students, framing this gathering as a celebratory occasion where the ongoing genocide in Palestine is reduced to a casual conversation over food, dangerously normalizes violence and erases the suffering of millions. We are appalled by the blatant disregard for the gravity of this issue and the silencing of voices that refuse to accept the normalization of this violence, of this genocide. We begin this with a quote from Palestinian American scholar Edward Said. Humanism is the only, I would go so far as saying the final, resistance we have against the inhuman practices and injustices that disfigure human history. Embody your own humanism. Recognize that this is genocide and we're paying for it. If genocide is okay to live stream, what else is it okay to do? Is it okay that we're sitting here having a conversation about the history of this region of the world when its indigenous people are being genocided, starved, and tested on for U.S. weapons? I want to share a quote from my friend in Ramallah. She says, "I'm so tired of hearing warplanes overhead and knowing they're going to Gaza. My heart is broken and cannot break more. I open Instagram and see the most horrifying images of children, and I won't let myself scroll on. If our friends and family witness these atrocities with their own eyes and they're forced to, surely we can stomach to look at them and say, I witnessed these massacres with you. Are you witnessing these massacres?
You fucking witnessed these massacres.
Taking them in, letting them move you. If you were, I do not believe we would be gathering like this. You would be as changed as me. Sickened at the thought of this event as a community dinner conversation centered on anything other than a plan for ending arms to Israel and a complete dismantlement of the genocidal settler state.
Facts.
Language matters. Much of our ethical work here is to free ourselves from the weaponization of language and ideology that convinces us that Palestinians do not deserve total freedom and liberation. Language that normalizes atrocities perpetuates the violence of these atrocities. Calling for peace without justice is violent. Calling Israel's genocidal campaign against Palestinians a conflict or a war or international events is violent. Framing genocide as something that can be looked at through multiple lenses is violent. Conflating Judaism and Zionism is violent. And centering Zionists without addressing the anti-Semitism and imperialism and violence that the Zionist project is rooted in is violent. How dare any person here call for peace without naming the occupation, the ethnic cleansing, and the genocide? Asking us to be peaceful about this is asking Palestinians to accept this violence against them, to request that they accept it quietly, to not resist ethnic cleansing, apartheid, killing, and hostage-taking for 76 years. If you are one of the many people who believe that the subjugation and dehumanization of an entire population of people equals peace in the region, then you are the ones who normalize violence in this world. Without calls for the liberation of Palestinians, we are all just settlers who cannot imagine decolonization beyond empty land acknowledgements. Commit to indigenous movements of decolonization and land back worldwide, or else stop this nonsense of claiming you care about peace and about safety and about the right to live. And let's not keep requiring Palestinians to audition for your empathy.
Taking a pause for a few minutes to allow folks to pray. Thank you all so much. We'll check back in a few minutes.
Good evening, everyone. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. وعلى آله وأصحابه ومن تبعهم بإحسان إلى يوم الدين. First of all, thank you all for being here. It's a new experience for me to have the whole event shut down so we can do our prayer. I was ready to slip aside. I appreciate the respect and the patience. That means a lot to us. I'm not speaking on just my behalf today. I have the backing of several communities, Muslim, Jewish, and Christian, who are praying for the success of this event. And the success of this event is from the grace of God, and then nice and noble, patient, kind human beings who are here to come and to learn and gain the facts that they need and have this amazing, sit down to break bread as neighbors and to hear different perspectives. I appreciate you all for being here. I'm going to be as brief as possible, simply just to respect your time. I do have faith in humanity. And one thing we have in common, I would hope, is that we do not tolerate things like genocide or apartheid or ethnic cleansing. And we sure can't be silently complicit in it. Well, the question is that what is going on? And that's what I hope to answer in our discussions. Also, rabbis against genocide would like to have a word. I'm here today to cut through the noise and the government-sponsored rhetoric that is just distracting people from the horrors that are taking place and preventing or delaying the appropriate response. There's a lot of confusion out there. People see a lot of nuance and a lot of this and a lot of stuff. What is the point? Let's cut through all of that and understand some context. There are millions of dollars, understand, that are being spent to convince you of lies or false narratives. And I'm here to dispel some of those false narratives, as if you pay attention with me, you'll be able to see. One is a notion that today we're dispelling together, is that this is a Jewish and anti-Jewish thing, where it's Zionism is affiliated with Judaism and you have to be both to be one. As we can see, that is not true. And again, rabbis against genocide would like a word. As well as my dear friends at Jewish Voice for Peace. Also, one of my dearest uncles who I grew up in his lap, listening to his stories, going through the woods, having to dig his way in Austria, in the forest, under the ground, to not be caught by the Nazi dogs. A Holocaust survivor who became a Muslim and is buried next to my father immediately in the cemetery in Oregon. I would like to build a different layer, as Professor Lee was saying, a different layer of context, preceding what she talked about and on top of it and with more details about some words she used like conflict and so on, and what that really actually means in reality. So, with the beginning of the advent of the message of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, one of his closest companions, Omar, was the one who was the leader of the Muslims in that very same generation. When the Muslims were given the key, that there was a peaceful transfer of power and an agreement that was made with the Christian leaders of Jerusalem. This provides a context that kind of answers this notion that there's a lot of money that is being spent, believe it or not, to make you see that Arabs or Palestinians are some kind of violent human animals that unleash, and if you don't keep them behind these walls, they're going to go out and massacre everyone because they're taught hate from their religion or it just runs in their veins. Let's see what Islam teaches from the very get-go. What it was one of the first things that he did. He went to the Temple Mount and he saw it covered with garbage. The Christian leadership of Jerusalem said that they were banning the Jews from having access to their holy site. One of the first things that he did was to start bending down and clearing up the trash immediately while giving the tour of the city and giving the Jews access to the Temple Mount immediately after the Muslims entered. And he also refused to pray in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre because he said that people will want to build a mosque where I first prayed when I came to Jerusalem, and I don't want them to wrongfully destroy a religious historic site. I believe it was that specific church. I may be wrong. There's plenty of professors who can correct me on that one. Salah ad-Din, Saladin. The Muslims and Jews and Christians lived in peace for a long time, as Professor Lee said. We should not gloss over that. There was hundreds and hundreds of years of peaceful coexistence. The Crusades then happened, and blood was to the knees. The Muslims came back. They had mercy on many of the transgressors, and when he re-entered into Jerusalem, he pardoned so many people, and it was done in a peaceful and the most beautiful way that he could possibly do it. And then Muslims lived under Muslim leadership. The Muslims, Christians, and Jews lived in peace. So blaming it on Islam or blaming it on being Arab or something like that as some kind of savages, this is nonsense rhetoric that, there are some people who benefit from you falling for that tired old story, so please don't fall for it. Okay? We're going to forward to, I forgot what the professor referred to it as, but the incidents around the Nakba. And she did a very good job of detailing the plots that were done in order to usurp the land of a people. You can do whatever you want on paper. You can call the nation a state or a nation state or whatever you want to do behind legal proceedings and start the League of Nations and then the UN and whatever. That means nothing to people who live on the land. That's the problem they encountered. So now they're like, okay, well, legally we've manufactured our way to kind of be able to start doing this thing, but hey, we still have a problem that these people have been here forever and we need to get them off the land. So how about we go up to the village of Deir Yassin and start slaughtering all the men and taking the women and girls, stripping them naked, photographing them, then slaughtering them, taking those pictures to different villages. How do you clear 500 villages and 750,000 people? You tell them, you want this to happen to you, then fight us. If you just run away, then where did those people go? West Bank, and they were forced, many of them, into Gaza. That's the story of Gaza. They are people who were displaced, who were already taken out of their homes, and they're pushed into the corner of their very own country. It's like somebody takes over your house. There's a comic that I saw. A guy's running out of his house. He's like, help me, help me, help me. What's going on? Oh, the people that I trap in my attic, they kidnapped my wife. What do you want me to do? Oh, help me. It's like, there's an easy solution here, the more you transgress, the harder it is to repair your transgression. So hopefully that's the direction we see moving forward. But whether they decide to or not, we have to do whatever is in our power not to be complicit in that, which is the reason why this is much more relevant an issue than Sudan and anything else, which we are helping. And I'm personally, you would be surprised to know my part in those other problems that are going around the world, but this one, my taxpayer dollars are contributing to, and I'm a part of it. So if I don't speak, then I'm guilty. I'm going to stand in front of God in the day of judgment, and for everybody here who's God-fearing, then please consider that. Okay? So what happened? That was April 9th, 1948. That was what led immediately to May 14th, 1948, which was the incidence of what? The creation of Israel. So that's the context in which the genocide and ethnic cleansing, and I'll call it what anybody who's fair would call it, I believe, and you're free to disagree with me, but that's what it was established upon. And don't get that wrong. Don't conflate that with Judaism. This was Zionism. These were Zionists who were given arms by ill-meaning people. There was a strategic reason why the British wanted to control that region, and they found a nice ally or religious, whatever. Okay, we'll work together. Yes, and Golda Meir was a passport-carrying Palestinian, so who was treated with the dignity and equal rights, and she was, a Palestinian citizen. So now I want to make a few things clear then, given all of that. On behalf, again, of the Rabbis Against Genocide, this is not an issue of Judaism or not Judaism. It is anti-Semitic, though, to imply that to be anti-genocide or to call it genocide is anti-Semitic. That's what's anti-Semitic, is that somehow you're against Jews if you call a genocide. That's crazy to me. Okay? Genocide is the deliberate killing of a large number of people from a particular nation or ethnic group with the aim of destroying that nation or group. By definition, that's genocide. If you define it as mass killings without morals and scruples and the breaching of international law and committing war crimes, then know that Israel has been condemned by the international community and courts and etc. For those exact things. If you were to try to attend the funeral of each child that was just killed in the last few months, one a day, it would take you almost 50 years. Those are their names. I didn't know that was me. I'm not working with those guys. I think they were mad at me. They think I'm being tokenized, but I'm not. The organizers are amazing. Please be fair and respect everything amazing that they did. They put themselves under pressure. They're being attacked by, from both sides. So God bless them and everybody who's participating. Okay? We're neighbors. I want to reiterate the point of this. We're neighbors. We're friends. We're in this together, and we have to come as a country to the right conclusion and stop aiding genocide. I'll give you some more context. Gaza itself, when they forced the people there, and I'll conclude with this, they forced all these people into a small area, and they controlled their water supply and the food supply and everything that's coming in, and even in the West Bank, all the checkpoints and everything, just to squeeze the life out of a people who, in Gaza, a female scientist, a girl, she learned a way, she developed a method of turning rubble into cement blocks or blocks that could be used to build new buildings. That's the type of innovation and the survival instinct and amazing initiative that those survivors do. Before the genocide, they had an average of 5 hours of electricity per day. 80% of their water is not fit for human consumption, and there are many more facts like this. This is and the genocide is only taking place because of our support in the United States. And by the way, the Lancet, which is a medical journal in America, estimates that the amount of dead is, I believe, 186,000, and not the other figures that you're hearing. In conclusion, when you have the whole world, including South Africa, tell you that apartheid is taking place, it's probably apartheid. South Africa says that it is. When you have the whole world, including Native American victims of genocide, telling you it is genocide, it's probably genocide. When your side has to silence the youth and find creative ways to restrict free speech, then you know that deep injustice is taking place and you're on the wrong side of it. When you have all of these things together, you have an abomination and an insult to humanity that we are all responsible for, and we support with our tax dollars, and hopefully we leave this program and this coming few days with the determination that we will not be complicit. Thank you very much for your time. God bless.
Thank Abubakr for speaking so persuasively and respectfully on such painful matters. He spoke in a way that I think people can really hear his message, and that's an important part. We're not just talking about Palestine and Israel, but we're talking about how we talk about them. We want to have effective communication. We want to come to something like this and go home saying, I learned something, I changed my mind. My mind opened. I understand more, especially I understand subtleties. So I really appreciate your speech, darling. You're wonderful, just wonderful. Such a wonderful person. And I appreciate everyone for listening so attentively. We had planned to touch, as I said at the beginning, on the religious elements of this long, difficult period of time with so much violence. And we have the question of whose Holy Land? Because that concept of the Holy Land dominates a lot of people's imaginations, and I believe drives a lot of the conflict. I'm glad people were respectful of the Imam. So I'm only a rabbi. I don't get that. I don't expect it. Whose Holy Land?
Your words mean more than mine. Thank you.
Well, I say your words mean more than mine, but I can't say that because that didn't mean anything I just said. So here's my overview of Jewish views of the Holy Land that are quite diverse and very important to this conflict. 2,500 years ago, my ancestors in the tiny kingdom of Judah were crushed by the neighboring Babylonian Empire that abducted skilled workers, slaughtered the population, destroyed the Jerusalem temple. 2 generations later, some exiles returned, rebuilt the temple, which stood for hundreds of years until the Romans destroyed it and dispersed the population across the empire. An ancient poet composed a song saying, "By the waters of Babylon we sat down and wept, remembering Sion." The name Sion, mispronounced Zion, referred to the highest hill in the city. For 20 centuries, Jews have mourned these tragedies, singing the famous verses I'll sing for you now. Al-Naharot Bavel, Al-Naharot Bavel, Sham Yashavnu, Gam Bachinu, B'Zachenu et Zion, B'Zachenu et Zion. Built across the Middle East and Europe, the bond with the ancient homeland maintained through our genetic makeup, and Jerusalem and Sion in daily prayers. Every day. Jews are only 16 million people, 0.2% of the world population, a tiny group with a wide range of beliefs. Envision a spectrum with the strictly religious at one end and the minimally religious at the other. People who live in exclusive religious enclaves at one side and folks who are fully assimilated like me. A shared history, but very different belief systems over time with different priorities and trajectories. For 3,000 years, our tradition was centered on texts and teaching, not territory. A portable religion you could take with you wherever you went for safety or security. We say blessings of all kinds for all kinds of activities, but there isn't a blessing for going to the ancestral homeland. Many of our greatest teachers never did. 100 years ago, a mystical poet we call Rabbi was elected chief rabbi of Palestine. He upheld the rights and praised the goodness of all people, but also taught of a mystical link between Jews and the ancient homeland. After his death, Rav Kook's ideas were used by many to center the land in religious Jewish life with great fervor, giving theological support to the rise of religious Zionism, one of the many competing streams of thought about Jewish return to Sion, which span the spectrum now from the Mafdal Religious Zionist Party in Israel, whose far-right leaders wield power, prolonging this war, all the way to the progressive Zionists of California, like myself, who work for lasting peace in Israel and Palestine. The word Kedusha means holiness in Hebrew, and it means something which is set apart, unique. The term Holy Land appears only one time in the Hebrew Bible. Admat HaKodesh, better translated as holy soil. But what do Jews...
Respect.
So what do Jews believe about the Holy Land? Back to our spectrum. Some of us read our texts as direct communication from a creator who rules the universe and has a special connection with the characters in our Bible stories. But some of us read our texts as evocative tales written by ancient authors. Why does this matter? Because what we believe about the authorship and authority of the text determines what we believe about the land as holy or not holy. Some Jews believe our texts are most authoritative because they are so very, very old, and only our narrative, written in ancient Hebrew, should be considered sacred. But some of us believe that other people have their own sacred stories set in the same physical place, and we must respect other religions' connections to that same real estate, even if their stories were written centuries after ours. I wish I could say that these questions of authorship and holiness are part of a friendly debate in the worldwide Jewish community. A machloket l'shem shamayim, a dispute for the sake of heaven, for the greater good. But I can't say that. Clashing Jewish beliefs about texts and territory are painful, impacting politics, conduct of war, and pursuit of peace. Donald Trump has said, Jerusalem is the eternal capital of the Jewish people, and many Jews agree, believing in a God who has a special relationship with our people and that city. But other Jews do not believe Jerusalem is our eternal capital, because for them, only the divine is eternal. All else is impermanent. What would peace look like? We need peace both between nations and within nations. Israel had 5 bitter national elections in the last 5 years. Fatah hasn't allowed national elections in the West Bank since 2005. Hamas has not allowed elections in Gaza since 2006. Very good question. Please ask your friends in Hamas why they have not allowed elections. Yeah, exactly. They have not. Israel doesn't control the national elections in Gaza or in the West Bank. But Hamas and Fatah have both scheduled and then canceled elections repeatedly. So along with the legacy of European colonialism, much of this misery is caused by opposing religious belief systems, both within Palestine and within Israel, with people willing to kill or be killed to become self-anointed heroes or martyrs. Religion has wrought havoc in the world countless times, but also gives us beautiful teachings on peace. The Hebrew word shalom means not merely the absence of violent conflict, but harmonization of opposing forces. Shalom is also a greeting and a name for the divine. Across the world, the great mystery, the source of life, has so many exquisite names. I love reading about them and learning them. But at my age, as a grandmother and a heartbroken citizen of our troubled, beautiful world, the only God or goddess I want to pray to is Shalom. Father Daniel.
Thank you, Imam. Thank you, Rabbi. Thank you all. I'm going to share my experience. I do speak on my own behalf. I am the rector of Christ Episcopal Church in Eureka, a follower of Jesus Christ, who I know is honored in Islam. Episcopal was a very good Jew. But I want to say, I'm going to share just two experiences, my two experiences visiting the Holy Land, and just say that I've been going through transformations in my understanding the layers that continue to peel, and I'm going through a transformation right now. I appreciate everything that's been shared, and it's also driven home the difficult reality that this is I had the experience of visiting the Holy Land with Christian Zionists and then later with Palestinian Christians, two groups that represent opposite ends of the diverse spectrum of Christian beliefs regarding the region. I first visited Israel 20 years ago with a group of Christian Zionists who call themselves Messianic Jews, Jews who believe that Jesus is the promised Messiah. Although there is variation of beliefs among Messianic Jews, they generally understand the formation of the state of Israel and the return of the Jewish people to the land as fulfillment of biblical prophecy. For them, the existence of Israel not only confirms the divine truth of the Bible, it also energizes them with the sense that God's hand is at work in modern-day politics and that they can be a part of God's plan by supporting Israel wholeheartedly. Messianic Jews and Christian Zionists are deeply invested in Jewish people resettling the land because many see this as a necessary step that must take place before the Jewish people accept Jesus as their Messiah and thus fulfill their interpretation of St. Paul's words in the book of Romans when he says, "A hardening has come upon Israel until the full number of Gentiles, non-Jews, have come in, and then all Israel will be saved." That's Romans 11. Christian Zionists, of course, understand the salvation for Israel as salvation through the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ. Since a great deal of anti-Jewish violence throughout history has been instigated and fueled by the church in the name of Christ, this prophecy of Jews eventually accepting Jesus as the Messiah is problematic, to say the least, and frankly offensive. However, although they may have very different goals in sight, many Jewish Zionists, not all, but many Jewish Zionists have accepted the support of Christian Zionists in the Jewish resettlement of the Holy Land. So in answering the question, whose Holy Land, Christian Zionists and Messianic Jews would say it belongs to the Jews. Now, 6 years later, I visited the Holy Land again, and I had grown a lot in those 6 years. I became an Episcopalian, became an Anglican, and I visited the Holy Land with a Christian, ecumenical, nonviolent liberation theology organization called Sabil, which is Arabic for the way. And it was founded by a Palestinian Anglican priest, the Reverend Naomi, who's written about liberation theology from a Palestinian Christian perspective. In answer to the question, whose Holy Land, these Christians would say it belongs to the Palestinians, who had, as we've heard, already been living there for centuries. With Sabil, I learned the perspective of Palestinian Christians whose story begins also in the Bible, in the book of Acts, at the Council of Jerusalem, about 50 CE, when Christian leaders, Jewish Christian leaders, decided to allow non-Jews into the church without having to convert to Judaism. It was a big debate in the early church. Many of these non-Jewish Christians remained in what was then called Judea. They remained there after Rome destroyed the Second Temple in 70 CE, and they stayed in the land when it was renamed Palestine. And I'd be curious to hear what Kathy, thank you so much for that brilliant presentation. My understanding that I've heard, I think from maybe both sides, is that the name Palestine was actually given sort of as an insult to the Jews, named after their lifelong enemies, the Philistines. But these Palestinian Christians lived in relative peace even when Islam took over the territory in the 7th century. And it's worth mentioning that the most sacred site, we mentioned the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, this is the most sacred site in all of Christianity. It's the premier pilgrimage destination throughout church history. The site of the Passion, traditional site of the Passion, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ. The family that has held the keys and continues to hold the keys to the church. Do you think it's a Christian family or a Jewish family? It's a Sunni Muslim family that's been holding the keys for centuries, since the 7th century. A neutral guardian for a site that is sacred to so many Christian denominations who are always squabbling over the property. Under tolerant Muslim rule, the Palestinian Christians, Jews, and Muslims lived harmoniously together for the most part. After World War I, the British independence to Palestinians while also promising a homeland for Jews on the same land the Palestinians. The British are very much at fault. I'm aware of that. I'm an Anglican. The British and then the U.S. equipped the state of Israel with enough military strength to fight the neighboring Arab countries and to treat the Palestinian Christians and Muslims as less than human. As more Jews moved in, many Palestinian homes were bulldozed and neighborhoods were destroyed. And after learning how to farm from the Palestinians, the Israelis seized the fertile plots of the land, leaving Palestinians with the barren territories. Many Palestinian territories now lack sufficient water supply, medical access, and other necessary resources for adequate living. From their perspective, Israel practices apartheid by constructing walls of separation in the name of security, hurting Palestinians through humiliating and dehumanizing checkpoints, and then branding them as terrorists whenever they attempt to stand up for their rights. And I visited a refugee camp, went to Hebron, where the Palestinians have to build basically a cage above them because the Israelis are throwing trash that would kill them. But if you look up, you just see a bunch of stones and bricks and trash. And this is in the city of the tomb of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. I might just imagine what they're feeling in the midst of all this. Any expression, this has been mentioned before, any expression of sympathy for Palestinians is often condemned as anti-Semitism. I have Jewish background from my father's side. I'm married to a woman who identifies as a secular Jew. I've preached and expressed sympathy for Palestinians, and I've been accused of anti-Semitism and anti-Judaism, and that is tremendously heartbreaking. Palestinian Christians who experience oppression from Israel emphasize the fact that Jesus also lived in that same region when it was occupied by an oppressive power, the oppressive Roman Empire, an empire that had him arrested and crucified for the crime of rebellion and sedition. So they offer a very different perspective on the Christian scriptures than the Christian Zionists. What would peace look like? I see peace in the Holy Land being rooted in the recovery and the reclaiming of the Jewish prophetic tradition, a tradition that I see embodied so powerfully in Rabbi Naomi and Rabbi Bob. A tradition in which Jesus clearly saw himself, Jesus was a prophet. A tradition that emphasizes care for the poor and the vulnerable, and that condemns idolatry. A tradition that is not afraid to speak truth to power, and to criticize political leaders when they prioritize their own selfish and idolatrous greed over the health and well-being of other vulnerable human beings. Many Israelis are already involved in this prophetic work, Jewish Voice for Peace, rabbis for human rights, rabbis against genocide. They're voicing their criticism of Netanyahu and his policies. I believe followers of Christ can support Israel's right to exist and defend itself, while also calling Israel out on their flagrant denial of human rights for Palestinians. In fact, I'm inclined to believe that Jesus the prophet would be doing just that. Just a couple more paragraphs. Authentic peace requires a willingness to listen to another's perspective. And again, I appreciate you listening. To tell the truth, to refrain from all forms of scapegoating and demonizing and dehumanizing. Whenever we do that, we're caught in what I understand as the Satan, which is the Hebrew, the accuser. You get caught up in this scapegoating force that is a powerful force and it's ultimately destructive. Refrain from that. To acknowledge the ways that we have failed to live up to our ideals of all Abrahamic faith traditions. Love thy neighbor as thyself. We failed to do that. For me as a Christian, this involves acknowledging and repenting of the horrific forms of Christian anti-Semitism and Islamophobia that have plagued and still plague the church. As an Anglican, this involves acknowledging the colonial history of the British Empire, which played a significant role in creating this modern Middle East conflict in the first place. As a U.S. citizen of European descent, this involves acknowledging and repenting of my nation's involvement in the removal and, yes, genocide of indigenous religions, tribes on this land in the name of manifest destiny. It's important whenever anyone in the United States points their finger at Israel, we're always pointing three fingers back at ourselves. Anglican Archbishop Desmond Tutu, South Africa, said there can be no healing without truth. And another Episcopal bishop recently said you have to tell the whole story before you can write a new story. I don't know exactly what peace in the Middle East would look like, but I believe it must include. And that's what we're doing here. It must include the freedom and the safety to speak our truths and to tell the whole truth, even when it's very difficult. This has been difficult. And thank you.
I want to thank all of our speakers tonight. Please give a round of applause for everyone who's contributed to the conversation and dialogue. Honor and appreciate the contributions. Special thanks to our travelers and those folks who helped to come in to guide us. Really wonderful. Appreciate the insights and discussion. We've planned for some time for dialogue and conversation. And we also want to honor the time that y'all have already given. If you have a few more minutes to meet the people at your table, to have a face-to-face conversation about some of the questions that were raised today, we would invite y'all to do that at this point. I also want to name that tomorrow night, this evening, we had an amazing discussion about faith. Tomorrow night, we're going to talk about trauma at the Warforger building. And of course, Friday night, we're going to talk about activism and organizing at the Church of Latter-day Saints in Eureka. We invite y'all to join us for free at all those events as we continue the spirit of dialogue, conversation, honesty, and the tough talk that we have to have in this time. So please, if you have the time and the energy, please meet the folks at your table, engage in some conversation, and we appreciate your presence and well-being. Thank y'all so much.